Hi everyone, Harry Frank here from Red Giant. In this tutorial, I'll be showing you Textile from Red Giant Universe. Textile is a plugin that generates random columns of content. There's a wide variety of data types that we can generate, and there's a huge number of options that you've got on each one. So I'd like to dive into the interface of Textile and show you how this works. So I'm going to create a new composition here. I'll create a solid to which I can apply Textile, and I can access it via Red Giant Universe text and accessing Textile there, or I can go to the Red Giant Universe dashboard. And if that's not visible, you can bring it up via Window, Extensions, RG Universe dashboard. This allows you to browse all of the plugins found in Red Giant Universe. You can also select individual sections and locate the plugin that you need. I can either click on Apply Effect or just double click on the thumbnail, and this will apply the default settings of Textile. You'll see that the Textile interface is divided up into a main settings group up at the top and repeating column groups below that. We'll cover the column groups in a bit, but I want to dive into the main settings. So these are settings that affect everything. These are essentially global settings that cannot be separated into a column. These are things like the number of columns, which is limited to 8, as you might guess. But we can define the number of columns here, the number of rows, the vertical spacing between the rows, whether or not it's scrolling, or if it is manually scrolling using this vertical scroll right here that you could animate, how the rows are sorted, which by default is a random order. Let me add just a few more rows here to demonstrate. If I set this to A to Z, this will sort the numbers and letters from A to Z or Z to A. There's a little weird thing that happens if you combine scrolling and sorting. As computers tend to do, it does exactly what we are telling it to do. So as it's constantly trying to sort the columns, it will also be constantly trying to scroll the columns. And it just looks like the data is kind of shifting and readjusting itself, which can be kind of cool and can be useful. But just note that sorting and scrolling do have slightly peculiar results. The loop row is going to be very handy for some that need to loop their data over and over. Let me set this to a random sort again. And we've got 20 rows here, and if I set the loop row to 10, this will loop the data and repeat it every 10th row. So our first value here is 1793, and at the 10th row you'll find it starts repeating the same values here. So as you manipulate your data, you'll find that you can set predictable groups of data to repeat. So that's the basics of what goes on here. A big part of the main settings is also where you format your text. Its default font is Courier New, which is just a handy font that works between Mac and Windows. But if you'd like to change your font and your overall type style, you can go in here under the text style window, change the font here, and you can also change things like the font size, justification, color, and tracking. But you'll find those controls also in the text settings group. The only thing that you have to define in this window is the font itself. But once I choose that font, I can always make the font a little bit smaller here, change the color here, as well as the justification and tracking. Now, if you want individual column font control, you can do that if you check this Use Column Text Settings right here. Once I check this, these will gray out, and you'll find a text setting group in each individual column. I'm going to leave this set to define the text settings in the main settings here. Now, you'll find a number of subgroups inside the main settings, so let's jump in here. Using a column header is pretty straightforward. If I check this, it inserts custom content at the top of each column. That custom content is defined right here under Edit Column Headers. And all you have to do is type a word and then hit return. And in each return, that word will be mapped to the header. So if I change this to, let's say, data 1, data 2, data 3, we'll see that the headers get replaced, and then there's a blank space where I didn't add a fourth word. If we are scrolling, the column headers stay fixed. Below that, we've got grid settings. We can turn the grid on or off. We can make the grid not quite as thick by adjusting the stroke width. And there's kind of one of those, hey, that looks kind of cool accidents during development where we actually can have the grid not complete and have sort of a partial completion like this. You can also shift the grid around a little bit from horizontally as well as vertically. But I'll leave this set to use a complete horizontal grid. Just below the grid settings, there's a section called Highlight. And if I check this box here that says Enable Highlight, we'll see that we take one row and we fill it with a solid color. We make the text larger and we have some characters inserted into the text. So we can emphasize a specific row using any or all of these parameters. The row that we are highlighting is defined right here in the highlight row. If we uncheck highlight entire row, then it'll just be highlighting one cell and we can define which column is being highlighted. The color that is being used to fill is right here and under this block fill color, as well as its opacity. And the character that's being used to insert at the beginning and end is right here. So we can highlight it with some sort of character like so at the beginning as well as at the end. Now the text color that's being highlighted is right here. That should be pretty straightforward. You'll notice that the rows above and below are also highlighted, and that is this highlight secondary color. If you don't want to use that, you can just uncheck use secondary color so that it's not affecting the surrounding rows. Also, you can make the surrounding rows a little bit bigger. This right here, this highlight ramp factor, when it's set to a value of 1, the surrounding rows will take on the size of the highlighted row. If it's set to 0, it will take on the size of the text settings. I'll uncheck this Enable Highlight checkbox, and we'll jump down to this section called Gap. In short, the only thing this really does is just add gaps to it. Now, this doesn't do it randomly. It uses a repeating order, and that order is defined right here in terms of how many gaps are on, and then we have gaps that are off, and then another set of gaps that are on and off. So if I check this, we should see a repeating pattern here of 4 on, 2 off, 3 on, and then 1 off. So this pattern right here, if you'd like to modify it, these are just repeating over and over. Now, if the content is actually scrolling, you have an option if the gaps are actually scrolling with the content, or if the gaps stay in place and don't scroll with the content. Now, the main settings here, we have errors, which as I turn this up, simply inserts errors randomly into the cells, and we can change what the error message is there. And like a few other of our text plugins in Universe, there is a basic glow and scanlines effect built right in if you need it. So from here, let's dive into the actual column content, because this is the heart of the plugin in terms of how we generate random data and the options that you've got. So let me turn off these gaps, and let's jump down to column 1, and we'll take a look at the data right here in column 1. By default, this is using a numbers data type, but any of these columns can be any of the data types that you see here: numbers, characters, dates, time, names, geography, data, words, and then a custom option. So if I change this from numbers to characters, you'll see that it's generating random strings of characters. And also, you'll notice that the characters section opens up. The other sections gray out and close up. So even though you might see a lot of settings in here, it's pretty well organized and pretty logical to figure out. If I change this to yet another type, let's say I set this to random names, you'll notice the name section opens up and everything else closes up. So let's jump back to that numbers section. We are generating random values between 10 and 20. If I set this to 1000, we'll have a much wider range of values. Pretty straightforward. How many decimals are being calculated and displayed is shown right here. And even stylistically, if you'd like to change what is being used as a decimal, that's also modifiable right there. Now, although it's great to display random numbers, numbers are units of measure. Numbers should always mean something. So if we're measuring something or we're showing some sort of currency, numbers should be able to represent something. So you'll find down here we have a few different options in terms of either adding a unit of measure. So there's just a number of different types of actual units of measure. Or there is the option to turn these into currency. So let's set this to much higher range of values. Also, maybe with these, I would want to actually use commas. And also note, outside of the United States, it's very common to actually use periods and commas this way. So there's an option to swap the periods and commas. But down here in the currency section, we've got the ability to render a currency symbol. And we can also use a currency code or just the code if you'd like that. But let me set this to the symbol. And if I twirl open the currency type, there's actually quite a few different currencies that you can have it randomly select in here. So note that when I introduce this Japanese yen, you'll notice that the values actually change quite a bit. And this is intentional. The range of values that we would have if you were just using, let's say, US dollars and euros, yen would have a much higher value because of the value of the yen relative to the euro and dollar. So just note that there's an actual currency exchange that is approximated. It's not daily updated. So let's move on to characters. Characters lets you generate all different types of random character strings. Right now it's generating between 6 and 12 random characters. If I set these all to the same length, I can generate a 10-digit string. If I don't want any sort of separator, I can just take that out. And the characters that are being used are defined right here under the random characters. It's using uppercase letters and numbers right now. If I check lowercase letters, that will just add it to the random character pool. I can also add symbols, or I could set this to something just like a hexadecimal uppercase or hexadecimal lowercase. Also, if you're using characters and or numbers, let's say if I set this to numbers and uppercase letters. If I set the number limit and character limit to 2, this will limit the characters to the first 3 values, A, B, and C, which are the 0, 1, and 2 value, as well as limiting the numbers to 0, 1, and 2. So it's just a way to restrict the character limit if that's useful to you. I'll add the character separator back in here. And note that we have control over the separator spacing, so how many characters are actually in between each separator that you render. So if I set this to 1, this will be every other character. If I set this to 4, it will do it every 4th character. Now notice that this is actually offset a little bit because it's only rendering 3 in the first one and then 4. The separator offset allows you to shift the groupings around. You can also add spaces around the character separator with the separator padding. There's a wide variety of things that you can come up with just using these basic characters. So it might be useful at this point to note that each individual column has its own preset browser. So if I click on choose a preset, this column can select any of these data types in here, and I can select these. So if I want to set this to a mixed set of currencies, I can do that. Or if I click on this and I just want a random set of percentage values, I can do that. So handy set of column-based presets to get you started. So let's jump over to the dates. This is just generating a random set of dates formatted the way you specify here. We can also set it to all caps. The year that it's using to create the random dates is based on this year right here. So let's say we wanted random set of dates around 2064. So if I set that to 2064 and I turn up this range is actually based in days. So this will be the date range around this year of which it will create random dates. Also, it's worth noting, because this was difficult to do, the values being generated by the dates are not sorted by alphabetical month. So it's not putting April first. It's actually sorting the dates properly. Time is also pretty straightforward. It's a time generator. We can have a 12-hour clock with AM, PM, 24-hour clock, and a time code clock. Now, when I switch this from 24-hour to time code, you might not see a huge change. For this to look more like time code, we would want to show seconds, and we would also want to show frames. This checkbox and the milliseconds rate sort of double between the 24-hour clock and the time code clock. So if I set this time code to use a milliseconds rate of 24, then we will have a time code base of 24. If I set this time rate to 1, this will advance in time 1 second in time here for 1 second in my timeline. If I'd like these to be random, there is a time random control right here that I can turn up. And there is a hours offset. So if I turn this up and this exceeds 24 hours, you'll be able to see the difference now in time code versus a 24-hour clock. So if I set this back to 24 hours, you'll note that it is bound and limited to 24-hour cycle, whereas time code can exceed 24 hours. If I select the names data type, you might guess what it does. It generates random names. It is assembling random names from a pool of first names as well as last names. The first and last names are internationally chosen, and the pool of names that are being used are a mix of either obviously male or obviously female, or a list of names that can be fairly neutral. By default, it mixes all three of these types together, but if you need one specific type, they are there for you to use. Now we can change things around quite a bit by using this name format. We can abbreviate the first name. We can use a first and last name with some sort of separator. But we can also take the names and turn them into an email address. There's also a shorter email address that just uses the first letter and last name. Beyond that, there's also just a random list of aliases that can be used, or you can assemble an email address from those aliases. Similar to the names is geography in that this also chooses a random list of cities from a predefined list. The list of cities is also international, so if I add or subtract different regions in here, we can represent a list of cities from around the world. There's an option in here to abbreviate the country in the case of outside of the US and Canada, or inside US and Canada, it will abbreviate the state or province. So far, we've had a wide variety of different data types, and you would think that these would just about cover anything that you might need randomly generated. However, there's a specific problem that often occurs when people are trying to generate random data types, that the data type needs to pass specific requirements and be realistic in terms of what it's trying to generate. And that's what the data type is all about. So if we set this to something like an IPv4 or even IPv6, that's obviously a much longer string to deal with. I can go up to the column width and widen that out just a little bit. We can also generate UUIDs. Now note that the separator in between the groupings is also variable. So usually with a UUID, this would actually be using a dash. If we set this to a MAC address, this would be separated by periods. Also, we have a phone number generator, and this kind of falls in the same category as the others in that it needs specific formatting for this to be realistic. So in the phone settings right here, we have a number of different formats that can be used. We have the option to encase parentheses on the area code, and we can also add a random country code in here. The country code can be restricted by these minimum and maximum values here. Also, sometimes it is a specific requirement that the numbers be fictitious and that they use the 555 area code. You can do that by restricting the min and max of the area code to 555. Or if you want a specific city, you could set it to something like 313 to make it a Detroit phone number. The last part to this section is the directories and files. And this is actually just randomly chosen. These are random directories and files that we can use to separate with, let's say, a /, and we can just have it look like a series of directories. And we can also turn these into files by checking a show extension, and it'll just randomly sprinkle some file extensions in there. Lastly, we have words. These are just randomly generated words from predefined groups. Those groups are selectable here. So we've got different types of verbs, generic adjectives, financial, medical, etc. There's also one in here that's called short. It just puts a short word in there. These are definitely things that wouldn't be sort of up in the foreground, but kind of kept small and left as sort of filler like that. There is a capitalization selector here, so we can have them all upper, lower, or even using a sentence case. Lastly is a custom section. So if all of those sections fail you and you need something even more specific beyond that, each column has a custom text area. And we can add our text in here and it will drop it into the rows and columns. Note that if I have fewer rows of content than I have rows rendering, it will just repeat the rows over and over. If we jump into the presets, let's say if I go to text style here and pull up something like body stats, you'll see a number of rows that are using custom data like blood type, eye color, gender, etc. So the overall goal of TextStyle is to be able to generate just about any type of random data that you would want. You can take that data and format into columns, but don't feel that you're restricted into using a bunch of columns and making things like cracked password lists or bank transaction lists, although it's perfect for all of those. But you could do creative things like just 4 cells like this, or just a couple cells vertically to make random content like this. Or there's even a single cell preset in here that just limits down to 1 row and 1 column if you like to just generate one random piece of data. So that is TextStyle. This was a collaboration between myself and a number of other designers that have to generate this type of stuff all the time, and they were looking for a much easier and flexible way of doing it. And that's how TextStyle was born. That concludes the overview of TextStyle. My name's Harry Frank for Red Giant. We'll see you in the next video.